Thank you. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to have a session right now that is strategies to eliminate fertilizer use and improve profitability on Kentucky cattle farms. And who not better to present on this topic than Greg Halich. And here's Greg. He's going to lead the show today. Greg?
We're good. Do you want me to use the mic? Or?
Please, it's recording.
So where's the handheld one?
Oh, the handheld one is right here.
Okay. Is this on? Yeah, I'm going to walk around.
I think it's this one.
It's on. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. And let me make sure. There's a very slight delay in this, so it'll take me a minute or so to get used to it. So in other words, I want to hit this maybe 2 or 3 seconds before I actually want it to go. So very broadly here today, number one, we're going to talk about things to completely eliminate fertilizer use. I had to fit the title a little bit. You can see I'm running out of room there, but really what the two overarching parts of the conversation is, one will be what can we do to completely eliminate fertilizer use on cattle farms, which if you're doing organic, you need to do anyways. And then the other one is just what are other things that we can do to improve profitability. And that section is going to be focused mainly, not entirely, but mainly on infrastructure. But we'll talk about a few different things. So very quickly, just for my benefit, but who here is actually certified organic for their livestock operation? One, is that it? And that was kind of what I was guessing. In other words, I assume the rest of us are either using organic practices or pretty close.
From a communications
would be an accurate statement. And there's some good reasons for that. Like in my situation, I could be organic pretty quickly, but there's not a huge benefit in terms of my market. You know, most of my customers know me, and then I wholesale to someone that is. So I do grass-finished beef. I've got 2 farms in southern Woodford County. Anyways, probably a lot of you are just like that. I was curious about that. So those are the 2 broad topics we're going to talk about. The first part, again, I'm breaking it in 2 parts. First one is concentrating on the fertilizer. And the first thing, and this should be obvious, that we can do to put a huge dent in eliminating fertilizers is on the nitrogen side. And that's learning just, what can we do to incorporate legumes into our pastures. And not a little bit, but a lot, like this picture. And this is the first farm I've had in Woodford County. And no, not every year I'm going to have that good of a red clover stand, but that's kind of the ideal. If we can get half that, even a third of that, kind of on average, you're probably getting all the nitrogen that you need to get into that system. This is on the other farm. This is one I live on, and this is one I'm still rebuilding. I'll show you a few pictures of that. This one I think I've had 5 years now. I'm still rebuilding this. It was completely worn out, but it's doing a lot better. Let me back up one. So I would say long run, clover is what most of us probably want here in Kentucky. And if you're like me, probably red clover works better for you than white clover. Just typically I find unless you're grazing pretty short, white clover is going to have a harder time competing with especially a really thick fescue. Red clover does a little bit of job. But long run, most of us are going to want this. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time to say how to do that. We have a grazing roundtable this afternoon, and maybe if you have specific questions on that, that'd be a good time to ask. There's going to be, I think, 4 of us there. But what I do want to do is highlight one legume that I see completely underutilized here in Kentucky, and that if you were here, if this was back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, this is probably 90% of what we'd be talking about in terms of legumes. So annual Lespedeza is something that is not used very much anymore, but again, 1930s, late 1930s, we grew about 5 to 6 million acres of this here in this state. Just for context, I think we have about 3.2 million corn and soybean acres. So every single corn and soybean acre, imagine that being annual Lespedeza and then increasing that by about 60%. It's a pretty staggering amount that we grew here. There's a good reason that we did that. It works here. We're probably in the heart of annual Lespedeza country. Why did we get away from it? Probably because commercial fertilizer became so readily available in the 1950s. So For those of you, so first of all, who here uses annual Lesbidiza? Just one. And that's typical. When I do a cattlemen's group and there's 30, 40 people, one or two, maybe at most three, and there's some meetings I have no one raise their hand. So the beauty, there are a few beauties of annual Lesbidiza. One is, this is probably about, and this is typically how most people are going to use it. This is in perennial pasture, so it was frost seeded just like clover would be. You want to do it a little bit later than clover, but in other words, it was overseeded in the existing perennial pasture. It's probably right around mid-July, and that's usually in a perennial pasture situation when it's going to be about ready to graze. It's a warm season legume, so it puts on very little growth until mid to late June, and when it starts getting hot and humid, this starts growing. That's the best way I can describe it. So the beauty is, when are your pastures typically going downhill? Usually mid-July, right? Unless we have a really good, growing year. And that's the beauty of annual Lesbidiza. It starts kicking in just about the time that a lot of your pastures really could use a boost. So you don't need it on 100% of your acres, but even if you have 20, 30% of your farm in this, it will really help balance out your forage supply. The other nice thing about annual Lesbidiza is it works wonderfully in low to fair fertility conditions. So if you've got either low pH or just low nutrients in general, and you can't get a good clover stand in, usually you can get a really good annual Lesbidiza stand in. In fact, the one caveat I will make is if you have a really good, if your pasture is vigorous enough that you are getting really good production, annual Lesbidiza won't work good in that situation because your grass and clovers will actually outcompete it. So you want to target in perennial pastures either fair, at most, you don't want to put it in a strong stand because it will be outcompeted. This is that same day I took that other picture. So this is just a close-up view in that perennial pasture. Again, it's mid-July, and you can see the bulk of that forage mass now is annual Lesbidiza. The quality is incredible. It can be as good or better than alfalfa. In fact, I'll make the comment in July and August, it's going to be better than alfalfa. It's not probably going to be better than alfalfa cut in early to mid-May, but at this time of year, it's going to be better than anything else we can grow in that system. Now, this is what most people probably haven't seen something like this since the 1950s. So this is actually how the majority of acres in Kentucky were grown in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Not in perennial pasture, they were actually grown as either specialty pasture or for hay ground. So in a pure stand, just like you're looking at, or a relatively pure stand. This was in Greene County, Kentucky. It was in row crops for the previous 5-6 years. It was marginal row crop ground. And at the end of the ethanol boom, so I think it was in 2015 or so, when prices came down, they took it out of grain production, put it back into livestock production. They took a chance on this. I had never seen it grow in a pure stand before. And I convinced them let's try planting an annual Lesbidiza for a year to see how it did. So I was pretty sure it would turn out like this, but I wasn't entirely sure. And so it worked extremely well. And if I zoom in on that picture, that's what that looked like. That was early July. The thing about a pure stand like this, or especially pasture, it has essentially no competition, so it's gonna be ready to graze quicker than a perennial stand. All right, so we've talked about this, works good in July and August. The other nice thing about it is you can broadcast it. And if you all are like me, my farms are not big enough where it does not pay for me to rent a drill, to go drive half an hour, pick up a drill, probably waiting there for 20 or 30 minutes until they're ready, get it back, have to calibrate. If all I'm planting is 5 or 6 acres, it makes no sense for me to rent a drill. So I've learned if I can't broadcast something, I don't use it, basically. It broadcasts beautifully, just like clover. The only caveats I will make is, and this is something, don't go to the extension publications for this because you will get burned like I did. Annual Lesbidiza, it's a warm season legume, so it has almost no frost tolerance. Once it develops its first true set of leaves, it will take a light frost, and I'm not sure exactly what the temperature is, but it gets down to 28, 29 degrees, it will kill it. And I learned the hard way that yes, it will kill those seedlings. So if you broadcast it, say in February when you would clover, If you get lucky, you'll be okay. If you're not lucky, if you get 3, 4, 5 days of 50-degree weather, say in early March or even mid-March, it will germinate. And so imagine it's even mid-March in Kentucky. If it germinates, what are the chances now we're not going to have a killing frost? About 0 to none, right? So don't make the mistake that I did for about 4 or 5 years until I figured that out the hard way. Don't even think about broadcasting it until about mid-March, and try to get it done in the next couple weeks after that. So second half of March is a good time to plant it. Last thing is, I have never found, and there may be some, but I have never bought annual Lespedeza that was pre-inoculated. So if you buy clover, it's always pre-inoculated, right? Unless maybe organic is different, but typical clover, any other legume like alfalfa, it's going to be inoculated. I've never found annual Lespedeza pre-inoculated. I'm guessing it's because you also will not find it hulled. It will always have a hull on it. My guess is maybe it's hard for that to stick long term. I don't know. But what I do know is if you've not had that in a pasture or hay ground in the last 4 or 5 years, if you plant it without inoculant, it will come up, but it will not be nearly as vigorous as if you inoculate it. So a small packet will treat 100 pounds, so 2 bags, and it costs about $10. So pretty cheap insurance, and it will grow a lot better in those situations. And it's in the cowpea peanut family. So it's not common, but you can order. There's 2 places that I've found it that you can order online. Okay, so yes, clover, legumes, clover, whether it's clover or annual Lespedeza, is a great thing to have in our pastures. Initially, when soil health isn't that good, it's probably the only way we're going to naturally get nitrogen in that system. But long run, we don't need those legumes. It's not saying we don't want them for other reasons, particularly forage quality, especially with fescue. We want legumes in there to help with that. But long run, once you build up the soil biology and once you build up your organic matter, you actually don't need those legumes. And the key is you need high organic matter, which is going to take time to build, and you need biologically active soils. And by the way, those 2 come hand in hand. You're not going to find biologically active soils with low organic matter. You can find low biological active soils with high organic matter because you can screw it up pretty quickly. But usually they go hand in hand. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. And you need good overall management. This is data from Alan Franz Lubers. So we'll talk about a bale grazing project, a 5-state bale grazing project. And I'll show you some pictures from that. Alan is leading the soil side. He's with USDA out of North Carolina, and he does a lot of good work related to soil biology. And this is just some very basic data that he shared with me that will help kind of make the link between biological activity, nitrogen mineralization, and then soil organic matter. So the first way I'm going to present this is highlight the soil biological activity. That's just a test that he does. Don't worry about exactly what that means. Think of it as an index. So the higher the index, the better biological activity that you have. And then on the bottom axis, that's the amount of nitrogen that we're mineralizing over the course of the year. This isn't perfect. He had to try to calibrate it because he's actually doing this test in about 24 hours to find out what the biological activity is. And so he over time is trying to calibrate that in terms of how that would be over a year. It's not perfect, so keep that in mind, but it's going to be close. So let's just pick a couple points here. So if you have low soil, this should be 200. Something is, anyways, we'll look at that. Something is strange going on here. But if you draw a line over, and it should have been around 200, somewhere in there, and draw it down, that is roughly how much nitrogen you're going to mineralize. On average, there's some variability. We'll talk about that here in a minute. And let's say we had double that index. So a level of 400, kind of the same thing, draw a line over, and then draw it down. And we're about 170 pounds of nitrogen mineralizing over the course of the year. So about 100 pounds more, right? And that's not, we're not out there spreading urea to get this. This is just God's gift to us for having good biological activity, which we'll see here in a minute, is correlated to organic matter. So in other words, this is going to happen year after year after year, assuming that we don't screw up that system. All right, so what I'm going to do now, we still have soil biological activity here on the x-axis. On the y-axis now we have soil organic matter. Now notice we still have that very strong correlation, positive correlation. And what I'm going to do now is pick two soil organic matter levels that on average are going to give us those 200 and 400 levels of biological activity. So roughly 2.5% organic matter would give us that 200 level that we saw mineralized about 70 pounds of nitrogen, right? And if I pick about 4.5%, that's going to give us roughly that level of the 400. You all see how I'm doing that? All right, so do you all see why having good soil organic matter is so important, whether you're in an organic system or not? So again, that's not 1 year, that's year after year after year, as long as you can maintain that soil health and hopefully improve over time, right, in terms of that organic matter. What I'm going to do now is show you that it's not enough, though, just to have that good soil organic matter. Your management is also going to have an effect on that biological activity. So remember, we're looking at 200 and 400 levels, but if I pick something about 3.75% organic matter, notice that we have in that range something that's about 200 and something that is about what? About 400. So in other words, on average, as organic matter increases, we're going to get more nitrogen mineralization, but also realize that it's also based on what? Why do you think we have variability within that same organic matter for different soil mineralization rates? Now, I'll give you a hint. Part of it could be soil type. That will have an impact, but he took a subset out of this and he tried to keep the soil type relatively constant here. So that would potentially be part of it. What about your management? Could that impact it? So in other words, have a farm, 400-acre farm, break it in half, have two different farmers now operating that same farm. Let's say they started at 3.75% organic matter. Now, you're not going to move that a whole lot in 1 or 2 years. So let's say 2 years later, we're still close to that same organic matter, but one farm, let's say did Brett walk in here? Brett's back there. Let's say Brett took this farm over. He's doing good rotational grazing, moving his cattle every day. He's making sure he's going to great pains to not overgraze when we get a drought like we had this year. He's bale grazing in the wintertime. The other farm goes back to set stocking. He or she is overgrazing those pastures. We get in a drought like this year, they completely grazed it to the ground. They're feeding in a sacrifice lot winter after winter. Can you all see how the biological activity of those two farms can change pretty quickly, even with that same organic matter? So your management can have a big impact on the ultimate biological activity. Now, one more thing to point out here. These were all volunteer farms. In other words, this wasn't a random experiment where Alan went out and said, you're going to be in this one. Generally, farms that volunteer for something like this, would they be ones that have better management or poor management? You all see what I'm getting at here? So in other words, we probably don't have the lower tier here. And I don't know this for sure, but if we did, I'm pretty sure that it would look something like that. We might go, Adam, would you agree? Yeah. So I can guarantee it's going to be below the 200. I don't know if it's going to go all the way down to 100, but I would be willing to bet probably it would. So what I'm trying to get here is that over time you want to build up the soil organic matter of your soil, but in the meantime you can do what? Improve your management, which, by the way, if you do it correctly, you're going to over time increase that organic matter of the soil. All right, so we're going to talk about bale grazing very quickly. This is not a detailed how-to bale grazing. I'd like to do that maybe next year or the following year, something like that. But we're going to look at this. This is something I've been doing for 15 years now. It's something that I cannot imagine feeding my cattle on either farm without being able to bale graze. By the way, the last 4 or 5 days, Adam and I were talking about this, was the ultimate time to be bale grazing, because I don't need to start a tractor. All I've got to do is go out and move, maybe 10, 12 posts, poly wire, and roll 1 or 2 hay rings, and I'm done. By the way, I couldn't. My tractor, unfortunately, normally I would have better planning. I would have at least a month and a half of hay set out in advance of any time during the winter. Probably because I'm setting up all these other bale grazing farms throughout the state, I got behind. The day before we got the winter storm, or 2 days Saturday, I had hay delivered. It wasn't even that cold. I think it got down to 12 degrees. My tractor gelled up, and I had to borrow a friend's tractor to get part of that hay set out. So I don't know what I would not want to have to try to start a tractor, not maybe yesterday, but the prior 3 or 4 days before that. So let's just look at bale grazing very quickly here. This is actually, so most of the pictures you're going to see here are actual farms, either my farms or other farms I'm working with. This is here at Kentucky State, which is, for a research center, is about close to actual farm that you can have. They manage, and Mike Wilson is here. Mike, raise your hand, please. He is managing the cattle on this farm. He's doing a great job. This was before Mike was here. This was Megan McCown that was managing the cattle herd at that time. This was her first winter bale grazing. So just, let me back up. That's about the density I like to see. So I won't go into any other details other than that. But here in Kentucky, where Brett's from, by the way, I'm from upstate New York also. Up there, we can feed at a lot higher densities than you see down here. But up in New York, what we had the past 3 or 4 days is, I'm not going to say typical, but more typical of what weather they're going to have here. Here in Kentucky, typically, if the ground is frozen, I like to say it's thawed by 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning after the sun has come out for a couple of. So you don't want to feed at real high densities. And again, I'm not going to go into details on bale grazing. I will provide a couple links at the end, videos that you can look at on that. But what I want to do is just talk about bale grazing from the standpoint of soil biological activity. So before we do that, though, let's talk about chemical-based fertility. So even in an organic system, do you all realize that you still have chemical-based fertilizer out there? All right, let's look at that. So basically, every cow pat, every urine spot is going to be you're going to have biology in the pats, but you're also going to have chemical-based fertility there also. So I like to, again, feed at that lower density, 2 tons of hay to the acre. Even at that lower density, that would be roughly how many units of NP and K in terms of chemical fertility that you're getting. That's assuming 75% is going back to the pasture, and that's conserved. So 50 units of nitrogen, 20 of phosphorus, and about 80 of potassium with decent quality hay. Now, in terms of understanding what chemical fertility means, and I will show you this pasture here a few different times. So this is the second farm I got in Woodford County. This is the first winter I was bale grazing. Actually, it's April, and I took this picture. We'll see the same pasture here. So on the farm, there's about 6.5 acres that was the best soil on the farm that was probably cropped for 200 years straight because it was the only really good row crop ground on the farm. So it was heavily abused. This is the April 24th, if I remember correctly. That is cereal rye in there. All that should be that tall. There's only one little good clump there that you can see, right? Why is that clump there? That was a urine spot from the fall. So chemical-based fertility does work. The problem is, for it to work, you're going to have to do it essentially year after year after year, and that's why we want biology to do that for us. This was on reclaimed strip mine land in Clay County. So the top was not bale grazed, the bottom was after about 4 or 5 years of bale grazing. So it does work in terms of chemical-based fertility. But more importantly, and by the way, until 6, 7 years ago, that's what I thought was driving all this, that chemical-based fertility. I've learned a lot since then. But let's ask the same question now, but in terms of biology. What's the biological value of that out there? So let's talk about that. So part of it is the dung. Part of it is just the waste hay in the process. This is mid-April when I took this picture. So this is a typical, what I call impact zone from the winter bale grazing. You'll have some waste hay. You'll usually have a tuft in the middle where the actual bale set that the cattle didn't get to kind of stomp down. What I want you to look at, and I'll highlight it for you here. Can you see those scratchings? Any ideas of what those scratchings are? And this will help you kind of get a cycling in biological fertility. Say it again? Turkeys. It wasn't turkeys. So it's mid-April when I took this picture. And I would say by late March, depends on the year, depends on how good your biology is, but definitely usually by late March, you'll start seeing this. And it's either skunks or raccoons or both, but they're scratching through that to get to earthworms. Because if you go there, again, anytime from late March on a normal year, at least until early June, maybe even early July, depending on how much soil moisture we get. When it dries up, they'll go down. But as long as there's good moisture there and until that hay is broken down, that will be covered in earthworms. They're breaking that down, assuming you have earthworms in your pasture, which some people don't have a good supply. So the earthworms are starting that process. And then what about our pats? So if we have good, healthy, we haven't been worming 2 or 3 times a year for the past 2 decades, and we actually have dung beetles, those dung beetles will start breaking down those manure pads. And so they're cycling that biology. And I'm skipping a lot of process in between those two, but ultimately what we want to really keep that biology alive are soil microbes, the fungi and bacteria. And that may take 2 or 3 years to get to that point where those are really kicking in, but ultimately that is what's going to drive our fertility, biological fertility. And this is what I call bale grazing. To me is what I'm highlighting that bottom. There's different ways that you can get that biology cycling, what I call getting the pump prime, but bale grazing to me is a great way to get that started. I know of no easier way to get it going than bale grazing. So very quickly, the project, it's a 5-state project. NRCS is funding it. Adam Jones is over here. He's involved here in Kentucky. Brett is leading the New York side in the back. And here's Kentucky State most of these are actual farms. Kentucky State has been part of this. Mike Wilson has been leading this. So they went through this last year. The high density is at the top, the low density is here. This winter, he will be doing this in the next couple weeks, but they're going to feed low density a second year and half it. So we'll essentially have 3 different treatments, and then we'll have a control that we're comparing all this against. So we're looking at soil tests, soil biological activity changes, but more importantly, from my perspective, we're looking at forage production differences in those treatments. And we're doing it for 3 years after the bale grazing. Here's one in Monroe County. They just finished in December. They've got a good drone shot here to help you kind of see what it looks like. By the way, you can see exactly where the lines are, but I can put it in. So the high density is up in the top right, low density in the left, and the control down here. Just so if you want to see how that goes. We are in our 3rd winter. We're still looking for farms that want to participate. This is the last winter that we're going to be looking at farms that we will do the measurements for 3 years. But the following 2 winters, next year and the following one, we essentially still want to work with farms as demo farms. So farmers can go out there, meet with them, have field days, that sort of thing. So if you're interested in that, see me maybe afterwards. So what else can we do management-wise? A simple one, in concept, difficult in practice, is simply to have low stocking rates, or what I call reasonable stocking rates. Because if I go out randomly on 10 farms in Kentucky, I should get Adam's perspective on this. I would say at least 7 are going to be 6 overstocked. He says up, 8, 9, somewhere over there. This is, again, the easiest conceptually, probably the most difficult practical to get people to do. So what is reasonable? I don't answer it directly in terms of how many acres per cow should you have. I'll give you my estimate in a minute. But it depends on how good your soil is, right? Also how good the biology is, and that changes over time. What I like to say is target no more than 3 months of hay feeding. So if you're feeding consistently a lot more than 3 months of hay, you're probably getting to the point where you're overstocked. And when I say, let's just say 60 days for simplicity. But when I say 60 days, what I mean is 60 days of full feeding. So if you're like me and you're not just hay or stockpile, you're mixing the two. So with me, they're usually getting half of their intake with stockpile, half with the hay. So I could feed 120 days in that system. That would be equivalent to what? About 60 days of full feeding, just to understand. The other thing I want to point out is it also means that you're not starving your cattle to get to that. Because I have a neighbor that probably feeds 120 days of hay, but he probably should be feeding 180 or 200 days. Because he's going at least a month in the fall and a month in the spring where his cattle are starving. So keep that in mind also. How many acres? Probably about minimum 2.5 acres per cow, up to about 3.5. And that's assuming you're using good management. And it could be a lot higher than that initially if you're rebuilding a farm. So look at this picture. Would you all agree that this is probably overstocked and overgrazed? So I want you to think about 3 different things now. Let's say that it's mid-August and we get 1.5 inches rain over half an hour. How much of that rain is actually going to soak in? We'll be lucky to get a ½ inch, right? Now, another thing I don't think we think about, maybe more important or as important as that, what about the soil temperature there? Let's say it's 90 degrees out. The air temperature, ambient air temperature right here, after the sun has been beaten down on that for 3 or 4 hours, what do you think the soil temperature is? I have actually tested it. It can easily be 20 to 30 degrees higher than the ambient air temperature. What's that going to do to your soil microbes? They're either going to die if you do it long term, or they're going to go dormant, right? Do you all see how this builds on itself? Last one, overall, and what we end up seeing is forage production, right? So once we get to that point, would you all agree we're pretty much shut down for the year in terms of forage production? And that's typically what we see. Now compare that to this pasture and ask the same questions. We get that same 1.5 inch rain, how much of that's going to soak in there? Probably every drop. We have 90-degree ambient air temperature. The sun has been beaten down for 3 or 4 hours. What do you think the temperature is going to be down near the bottom of that soil? Has anyone stuck their hand down there to see? It will actually be cooler than the ambient air temperature. It will be a lot because you will actually be able to feel it with your hand. How are the microbes going to be doing in that system? They're going to probably be kicking along a lot longer, right? Maybe a month or better. All right, so what else can we do? Obviously, get some diversity in our forage. So legumes are part of it. A lot of people don't like Johnson grass, but to me, it's God's gift to Kentucky if you know how to manage it. Maybe not in hay fields, right? Because you'll have, but in a pasture, I can think of nothing I would rather have in that pasture in July and August other than annual Lesbodisa, and it mixes good with that. So there's lots of things you could put in there, but what I'm going to do is show you an easy way to get pasture diversity. That's assuming you're bale grazing. So if you're like me and you bale graze and you have a bunch of these spots in the spring, a lot of people say that's ugly, you know, we're not growing forage, and that's true. If I do nothing 2 or 3 years, it'll take 2 or 3 years to fill in, and by the way, it'll be more productive after that time than it was before. But take advantage of it. Assuming we have decent quality hay, and that's what most of mine will look like. If you have a thin thatch of waste hay, and you've got some manure and urine in there, that is a perfect what? It's a perfect seed bed. You can get about anything that you want to grow in there. So what did I do years ago? Just because I didn't know any better, just orchard grass, clover, maybe a few other things. What I target now is what you're going to see in the next few photos. So I will zoom in on this, and hopefully most of you know what I'm looking at. So I love forbs, chicory, plantain, burnet, and what I've found is I can't get them into my pasture, an established pasture very well, but when I have that nice seed bed, they will take very easily. And so that is the primary way that I get those forbs in my base pastures now. So there's chicory, the wider leaf, there's plantain, the thinner leaves. Who here had a pretty bad drought last summer like I did? So I was in southern Woodford County. I think Mercer County was a little bit worse, but Henry County was probably a little bit worse, but otherwise I think I was in the top 5 in terms of drought. This is about a week and a half before we got the hurricane, so it was like September 20th or something when I took this picture. I still had forage, and if we probably won't have time at the end. Hopefully we can talk about it at the grazing round table. But one thing I've been doing the last 4 or 5 years, when we do have a drought, I actually bale graze in the summer, very low densities, to get through that drought. I'm not going to show you how to do it here. We can talk about it later. But what I do want to show you is that's what I was doing here. And I had a fence set up right there that I just took down. You can all see the cattle are starting to come up there. So the cattle had access on the right side of that, and they knew. So I guess what I need to say is you all see that circle? That was a bale grazing spot from the previous winter that I seeded that spring. Now, yes, there are a few weeds in there, but for the most part, I guarantee that 60% forbs in there. Cattle knew that the forbs were there because guess what? The previous time they had access to a circle just like that. The cattle learned real quick. So my cattle don't normally do this, but what I want you to see is how excited the cattle can get when they know where they're going. And it isn't coincidence that the boss steer is the one that was right in the middle of that. It's not coincidence. So the cattle love those forbs. Believe me, they just absolutely love. I'll show you a picture of why I think. I don't know for certain. So chicory is over on the left. What New Zealand calls ribgrass, this plantain is on the right. Can you all see maybe why the cattle like those forbs so much? They've got root systems like nothing else that we have that can get down there and get all sorts of trace elements that we might not have in the upper soil profile. Now that said, remember that 6.5 acre, what used to be tilled soil for 200 years? I've learned through this process. So who here has heard of herbal lays? One. Okay, that's it. That's not surprising. So it probably was something that originated in Britain in the 1800s, kind of got out of favor in the 1950s, 60s, except for people like Newman Turner that still were doing it. But for the most part, we kind of, like annual SBs, kind of forgot about it. Until the last 10, 20 years, they started doing it in England, New Zealand, and Australia. So this was my first attempt at herbal lays. I had many herbal lays, but I did this on 6.5 acres, and I'll show you how it looks and how it turns out. This was actually in November. So the chicory, plantain, burnet will be most evident in the fall and spring. You'll see why here in a minute, because that's not the only thing I plant there. So that was the same day, so you can see the chicory and plantain a lot better. The burnet is not easily seen. I think, I highlighted there. They're more in clumps. By the way, that does better in the cool season than those other two, but it kind of shuts down the summer. And I've just been using that for 2 or 3 years. Those are what I call the base of the pasture, but I mix in other things. So they will grow decent in the summer, but they won't thrive in the summer. They probably will up in upstate New York, but not here in Kentucky where it gets so hot and humid. So in the summer, I want something else growing that will take over that system. Given what you all know about me, what would that be in summertime? Annual Aspidisa. So the herbs are still in there. The chicory, plantain, the burnet is still in there, but and I'll zoom in a little bit, and you can see some in this picture, but for the most part, they're kind of going semi-dormant. The annual Aspidisa is taking off for July and August. And then in September, October, November, the chicory, plantain, and burnet will take that system over. And by the way, I seed in some type of winter annual in either late September. Into that. What I want to show here is this was early April, and I will highlight this. I assume you can all see that, but can you all see those perfect circles in there? Again, knowing what you know about me, why are the circles there? I bale grazed there, right? Now remember, this was completely dilapidated soil, heavily tobaccoed for 200 years. I'm still rebuilding it, but the rye that's there even outside those circles this is early April. The other picture I showed you when I started was April 24th, and those were the spindliest things you ever saw. So it's improving over time, but I'm not there yet on that 6.5 acres because I've got 200 years of essentially abuse to deal with here. Now, the reason I've not done more bale grazing here strictly because what I found the first 2 years when I was doing it, and these were from the first 2 years I bale grazed, so probably 4 or 5 years ago. Unfortunately, what I found is I want a system where I can keep my perennials out and the grasses were coming into the system. So I stopped the bale grazing until this year. I got native warm season grass hay that I'm not worried about that. Some people wouldn't care, but for me, I'm trying to keep this more of a summer production system so I have something really good for my finishing animals during that time. Now, this will be more start. My mother visited in early May last year, and I don't even need to say anything about that. That was where I bale grazed 4 or 5 years ago. Can you all see how good that rye looked? Now, if you were an organic grain farmer and were planting rye, wheat, or corn in the summer, can you all see the possibilities in that system? All right, here's a few more pictures of the herbs. So here's chicory, plantain, again, is ribgrass, burnet is that beast right there. Cattle love all of them. What I want to try this next year is sandfoin. It's a legume. It's a perennial legume, but has a really deep taproot and will take lower fertility conditions than alfalfa. Yarrow and sheep's parsley are two things that like Newman Turner always used. I have not been able to find those here in Kentucky. Have you found them? Have you found either yarrow or sheep's parsley seed that you can plant? Yes. I've not been able to find, what I'm saying is I have not found those two here in the United States. We'll talk later, but I have not found them yet. I would love to try them, but even having 3 of those 4, as you can see, really help out. Very quickly, I'm going to show you, I stole these slides. I hope I don't get sued by Christine Jones, but this is New Zealand, and most of New Zealand is what you see in the background, strictly perennial ryegrass and clover. Now, this is on volcanic soils, so they're really light colored, and she took this for that reason because you'll see how it stands out. And then this is an herbal ley in the front that has only been there for 3 years. So look at the soil. This is on the ryegrass clover. You can see it's almost all the volcanic soil still. It's just 4 or 5 inches at the top that is dark. Now, I'm going to show you the next picture in the herbal ley. Keep in mind that has only been there for about 3 years. And that's what it looks like. And she claimed that they dug 100 holes because they kept thinking that we hit an old root of a tree or something, and literally the farmer dug like 100 holes because he was going crazy. He couldn't believe how it had changed the soil after just a few years. So it does wonders for our soil, but just as importantly, it does wonders for our cattle. So last year, for the first time, I started custom grazing some dairy heifers for a raw milk dairy farmer. This is Mila. She was getting ready to go out in about a month and a half when I took the picture, and then she calved probably a month and a half after that. This is mid-August during our drought, which, by the way, the only thing that was growing well was the annual lesbidiza. I'm not an expert on dairy cattle, but would you all agree Mila looks pretty good? All right. What about, we all like to think we don't have weeds, right? But most of us do, especially in the initial phase of rebuilding a farm. But what I have found, and by the way, I learned this from Newman Turner also. I don't know, have you read his Fertility Pastures and Fertility Farming? Okay. Yeah, he was big on what? Using weeds to build fertility. It makes perfect sense, whether you're in a garden situation or a pasture or whatever. So this is that same 6.5 acres I told you before that had been tilled for 200 years. This was the second or third year that I was reclaiming it. So there are the chicory, plantain, and the annual lesbias in the understory. This was, like I said, 3 or 4 years ago. We actually had a drought in late May and early June. Then we got lots of rain later in the summer. But what happened was the soil is terrible. First year, literally, in the summer, if it didn't rain in the last week, I had a hard time getting a stepping post in that soil. It was that platted. Now, it's improved considerably, but this was one of those first couple of years. So if you don't know this, ragweed thrives in those kind of conditions. And we had a drought, again, late May and early June, which we typically don't, but those ragweed seedlings just took off, and everything else was kind of dormant, and so who had the upper hand when we finally got the rain? The ragweed. So I had to deal with the ragweed. I could have left it, right? It would have died off naturally. I could have sprayed it, which I didn't. By the way, even if I had a spray that wasn't going to have any long-term effects on the soil, wasn't going to have any long-term effects on water quality, I'm still going to argue I'm better off mowing that than spraying it. If I spray that, what's going to happen to the ragweed? It's going to die, but what's going to happen to the actual plant? Is it going to break down for the biology? It's going to break down by oxidation, right? So the leaves are going to turn brown, they're going to fall down. You'll get the chemical base in there, but you won't feed any biology through that process. If I mow that down, I want you to envision the bale grazing, the thatch of hay that's left over. Would that not be a whole lot like that thatch of hay? But instead of one little spot all through the field. And that's what you're doing. That's why Newman Turner, I think, loved using those weeds for fertility. You're sheet composting those weeds, correct? If you have the biology. This is actually my favorite, Newman Turner. I love Newman Turner, but if I had to pick just one person that I could learn from, it would have been, if I could go back in time, it would be Albert Howard. This is one of my favorite quotes from him. So, the destruction of a pest is the evasion of rather than the solution of all agricultural problems. What does he mean by that? Let's go back to spraying. Even if I could spray that and kill all that ragweed out, if I don't change my management, if I don't get at the underlying issue of what caused that, which in this case is 200 years of abuse, what's going to be back in 2 or 3 years? The ragweed. This is in northwest Woodford County. It's Lucy Smith and her family's farm. I've been working with her for now about 3 years. This was 2 years ago. It was before the first year of bale grazing on a treatment that I'll show you here in a minute that Adam visited. So did we tell you the story of this? So this is the fall before you saw it. In Lucy's farm, she's got beautiful soils, but let's just say that they were underperforming. Partly because she got away from chemical fertilizer, which is fine, but she wasn't getting the biology going. So she was in that limbo stage. She was getting away from chemical fertilizer, but her biology was just not kicking in yet. So one thing I got Lucy to do that she kept hemming and hawing about is, I said, Lucy, while you've got these weeds, you've got to do what? You've got to clip them in the right stage so that you can get that biology going in addition to bale grazing. So she took this picture. She clipped it within a week of taking the picture. Now, I'm not going to say that this was all due to the clipping and her management. I came back, it was roughly November 10th. Again, look at what you see here. You had to get down on your hands and knees to find good forage in there. On November 10th, when I came back, this is what I saw. About 1 zillion red clover seedlings. Now, we'll never know exactly what happened there. All I can say is it was like a miracle, because she was not expecting that. In fact, it was so good that I told Lucy, I can't necessarily advise you bale grazing on this because I don't know if those seedlings will take the bale grazing. We had picked that field because we thought there's nothing she could hurt there. All of a sudden, we have something that she can potentially hurt. So I was worried about it. In fact, all winter, I was worried, how's this going to look in the spring? Adam came out with me. Adam, I'll let you tell the folks what I'll click it for you, and you can.
Well, back up for a second. Greg's talk is about reducing fertilizer usage. And Lucy wasn't focused on organic, but she was focused on the cost savings. That we know what the cost of commercial fertilizer and how much it's went up. So, really not sure exactly where all the red clover came from, but it was unbelievable to see that stand. We're all of average height. Most of it's all knee high, 18 inches. Okay, so knee high red clover. A little bit of orchard grass, a little bit of timothy, mostly tall fescue, and just as thick. It was challenging to walk through.
And they kept walking around.
We thought we'd find spots where it didn't exist, and the further you walked, the more you saw, and then eventually you just kind of gave up.
That's what I was taking pictures while they were just walking around in the days.
So it was amazing. It's no matter what, at that point, whatever she wanted to do with it, whether it was bale it for hay, graze it. And for her cattle numbers, she was going to have a struggle to keep up as fast as that was growing.
So not luckily that we had a drought. We had a drought, and she was able to catch up on it. So, but that was because she had all that. All right, so that's kind of the end of that section. We're getting to part 2, which will go quicker. And this is what can we do infrastructure-wise. And the way I like to phrase this, how can we have just good basic rotational grazing without spending a lot on infrastructure? That's what I'm basically going to show you here. So first thing, I just threw this in there. It doesn't really fit perfectly. But if you've never used a good portable solar energizer, they make some, get a good brand. Stayfix is no longer in business, but Speedrite, they bought them out. It's the same energizer. It looks different, but it's got the same guts and everything. I've had that for over 15 years. I've replaced 2 or 3 batteries, but it's still kicking. And I bought a Speedrite here a year ago for the other farm just to have on hand. So and Gallagher makes great, similar. So just get a good name brand. All I'm saying is it weighs like 10 pounds. You can put it on you can see it's got a push-in grounding rod and with a T-post adapter on it. They make them so they're just very easy to use. So anyways, just want to make sure that you realize they make really good solar energizers now. What I'm going to do now is just show you, this was the second farm in Woodford County, the one that's got the 6.5 acres up on top, which is on the west side there. I'm going to show you how with very little infrastructure I was able to make this work. So what I did is I just used fiber rods, old step-in posts that had a bunch of different things broken off. I just pieced it together. What I will say though, and then one poly braid or poly wire, don't get the cheap poly wire. Get the 9-strand and get it a fairly thick wire. It's a lot more conductive, but just importantly, cattle see that a lot better, deer see that a lot better. You'll just have a lot fewer problems for many, many different reasons. Then I used above ground polyethylene pipe. Make sure you get the 180 PSI. I think they make 100 PSI, but make sure you get the 180 if you're gonna do that. The key to using that is you need to put it in fence rows. So somewhere where you're not gonna drive over with a tractor or your cattle aren't gonna be stepping on. And then also in the fence rows, the grass grows over it and you'll have the shading effect there for it. So here, very quickly, this is everything you see in red dots was that 1-wire internal subdivision. And the blue dots, so that's where I had one tank, 170-gallon tank, and the blue dots is that one, it was a mixture of 1 inch and 3/4 inch because I had some of both to get to that point. So I think it was about 1,200, don't quote me on it, but about 1,200 linear feet to get to that point. So what I'm gonna do now is just show you how I made this work. Every farm is gonna be different, but I'm gonna show you how, with all that with minus the tank was well under $1,000. I already had the tank, but easily under $1,000. So again, every farm is gonna be different, starting from the water tank, moving away from that. Those are roughly daily moves, and not necessarily that I move every day, but if I was. And by the way, I'm well over 800 feet. NRCS has an 800-foot rule, which makes a lot of sense in some cases. And what they're afraid of is that you're gonna overgraze towards the water. What I'm gonna point out though, Adam, you and I have not talked about that or this, but that is very different between the way I'm doing it versus if you put all the cattle in that paddock and had the 800-foot rule at that point. So in other words, if the cattle weren't being constantly moved across, they would start overgrazing the western side and they would start undergrazing the eastern side. But as long as I'm moving the cattle so they have plenty of grass when I move them, the only reason they're gonna go back to the water is for water, for shade in those trees. And so yeah, we've gotta be careful when we're especially out there. We don't wanna make them go hungry, but so it's more management based. In other words, your management is gonna have to compensate a little bit more for the infrastructure to make this work, which shouldn't be a problem with this audience. So we shut that off, we open up to the west, kind of do the same thing, and very quickly we can do that all through. And what I'm trying to show you, I had 21 paddocks with that one water source. Now, is it ideal? No. Is it gonna be NRCS approved and cost share? Probably not, but did I make it work? Yes. For a very reasonable amount. The only place that I overgrazed was that area right there, where they had access to water on the south side and where they had access to what on the north side? Trees, which by the way, even if I had the perfect infrastructure, they would still want to go back to the shade as Brett was talking about yesterday. And we'll talk about that at the very end, how you can get away from that or that problem. What I'm going to talk about now, this is actually, Brett, raise your hand. Brett is my friend I'm from upstate New York. But I did not know Brett until I was here in Kentucky, which is another story. So I learned about bale grazing through Brett. I like to say I adapted it to Kentucky, but I did learn about bale grazing from Brett. And the other thing I learned from Brett, I learned a lot from Brett, but the other major thing is what we're looking at right here. So Brett he didn't invent this, but I like to say Brett perfected what I call the living tree method, and I'll show you the key steps. So basically he uses living trees. The main thing is you do not want to pound staples or whatever or wire directly into trees, but notice Brett has something between the tree and all that hardware, right? And I've seen this used in Kentucky, but 95% of the time when I see it used in Kentucky, that is not hardwood, which is what Brett used and which I use in New York. They're treated 2x4 posts. The big advantage to this, or the downfall of the 2x4 posts, is it's softwood, and nails and washers can get pulled right through that softwood very easily. The other thing is people don't realize, but in this situation, you don't need a treated lumber there because you're not touching the soil. You're not going to have a lot of contact with wet grass. That's going to dry off very quickly, and it's not going to rot. Brett can tell you later on, but I'm guessing that will easily last 20 or 30 years. Probably, I'll make the comment, longer than most posts that you buy today. Treated posts. The key is, again, hardwood. He likes 1.5 inch wide by about 3 or 4 inches wide. I've used 1.25 inch wide, and I found it's fine, but I'm sure he has a reason for 1.5 inch. The key, though, is what I'm going to show you here. One is he uses galvanized nails so they don't rot or rust easily. The other is he has a washer between that hardwood slat and the nail. So imagine that tree is growing. It's pushing out on what? On the wood slat, right? The wood slat is pushing out on what? Not the nail, it's pushing out on that washer. What's the name of the washer? Fender washer. They have a very small hole, so they're pushing more on. Do you all see what he's getting at? And they're a special one to do that. So it's a system. The tree grows, pushes on the slat pushes on the fender washer pushes on the nail. The end result is that tree could grow from 5 inches to 30 inches, and that fence our quote post will grow out with it. It will never you will never have metal that stays in that tree. This is obviously the ends are kind of the key, right? Because that's where the tension is. I'll let Brett maybe not now, but later on this afternoon, he can talk more about this because it's not a good photo here to show you. But obviously this is the key, your ends. He uses big spikes and big washers. You can't see it really good in this picture. But if we have questions, let's talk about that this afternoon. All right, can be used with woven wire. This is a friend of Brett, someone I know. This is John Burns, right? You sent to me. You can use woven wire on it. In fact, it looks like he insulated the woven wire. He's got sheep. But all I will say is it works beautifully. It works better for high tensile. It's made for high tensile fencing. So cattle, very easy fence to put up. This is the farm in New York. This is where I'm from, or 1/4 of it after my grandfather died. So what I'm going to show you is I no longer have sheep here, but I had sheep for quite a few years while I was living here in Kentucky. Obviously was not doing the work, had a partner. But I had that permanent fence built up that was woven wire with a high tensile. And so I know exactly what it costs because I paid for that. And then my partner put up the fence that we just looked at. So the living fence system, and you'll see it was more than double, or it was not double, it was a lot more than the permanent fence I put up by a contractor. And so everything in red was done just like I showed you, and it was done for about 15% of the cost. And that's including paying him a fair wage when he put it up. About 15% of the cost. 15%, yeah. 0.15, yeah. On a per foot basis, yeah. All right, we're going to switch now to water. So one thing I was amazed by when I came here in Kentucky is where we're from, everyone has a well or spring or something like that. When I came here to Kentucky, it's like, what is county water? I'd never heard of it before. Now, there are good advantages to county water, right? It's pressurized, the electric can go off, we still have pressurized water. But what I did not realize, I had a hunch, but what I did not realize until about 3 weeks ago is how costly it is for putting cows on it. Now, I happen to live in I live in Woodford County, which you will see is the cheapest water in the state. So that was one of the reasons I didn't realize it wasn't a big problem. So the assumptions here, we're going to have, and I don't know, it may be 15 gallons. Jeff Lemcooler and I asked him about this. He told me he used 20 gallons a day. I've been talking to other people. They think it may be closer to 15 on average. It's going to be more in the summer, less in the winter. One thing people do not think about is if you have county water system, do you think you're never going to have a problem and you're never going to have a leak somewhere? The answer is what? You will have, and it may not be for 10 years. I had a $500 bill once. I thought that was bad. I've talked to at least 3 farmers I know that have had $1,000 plus bills. The biggest one was, after I showed this presentation, was a county agent. I won't say who it was in Western Kentucky. He didn't say it during the presentation. He came up to me afterwards. He said, Greg, I had a $2,600 bill, and I already had, most places give you one grace bill. That was my $500. I didn't actually pay it. But he had already used his grace. He had to pay $2,600. Now, he said they gave him the water at the wholesale rate, which was about, he had like a 30 or 40. In other words, he used so much water, he qualified for a wholesale rate, like if you're selling to the neighboring county. Point is, you are going to have some problems. So build that in. I put 7.5% leakage. Oh, shoot, going the wrong way. Let me back up. All right, so I obviously couldn't put all the counties. Woodford's at the top, lowest, and the highest rate I found in the state was Morgan County. So this would be for a per cow per year basis, using 20 gallons on average with a 7.5% leakage. Now, again, I'm in Woodford County, but even at that rate, I thought, this is, you have a bunch of cows, that's going to be a pretty big bill. And you can see, so I've got a herd of 25 cows, 50 cows, and 100 cows. And folks, you can see how costly that can be. Now, right now, calf prices are great. You can make the argument we can afford that, and you can, right? But we all know these calf prices aren't going to last, right? And what I would say is you have let's even say $75 bill per cow per year. On an average year, that might be your gross profit. In other words, you would have made $75 per cow. With your water bill included, you're down to breaking even. So what can we do? What can we do? This clicker is just a little finicky. Let me back up. There we go. What can we do to get away from county? And some of us are, like my other farm, I've got to have county water. I don't have a good place for a pond. This is the farm, the second farm that I showed you with the 6.5 acres over here. So not everyone's going to have all these, but I'm going to show you a few different scenarios, and hopefully some of you will have some of these options. So what we're looking at, the bottom blue dot, is a spring I have. It doesn't run year-round. It generally will start running in mid-December, and it will be pretty dependable at least into mid-May, sometimes on a good year up through early July. What I do, though, is that is where I water my cattle in the wintertime. So I siphon out of the spring, and I'll show you how to do that very easily here in a minute. I've got about 50-foot garden hose to get the siphon started, and then I just keep hooking up garden hoses to that to get them out of that swampy area, and then I've got a 100-gallon tank right there by the road. So the way you do this, so that's the inlet, that's the spring. Notice there is a garden hose valve on. You have one in both your 50-foot section when you start the siphon. All you got to do is take that to your house or a hydrant somewhere, hook up to that, turn it on, get all the air out of it, shut the end off, shut the front off, and you've got a pressurized system that you can start a siphon anywhere you want. And if it stops, you just got to take that 50-foot section off to reprime it, essentially. That was a year ago, so when I set up in mid-December, I get about a gallon and a half per minute out of that, which is all I need. That was an hour and a half after I started. It was filled up. That's where the spring is back there. This was after our first snow here about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. Next picture is about a week after the storm. What I want to show you is the reason it doesn't freeze up is right there. Folks, when you have running water, it's amazing the energy you're generating. Can you all see that? That melted 4 or 5 inches of snow and ice down there. That was this Tuesday. So that I wasn't able, they forced me to get the presentation here, but after 2 of the coldest days in Kentucky, that evening, that's what it looked like. I'm not going to say it's foolproof, but if I got through those 2 days, I'm pretty sure I can get through 99.9% of Kentucky winter conditions. This is a pond. This is the first farm I had in Clark County, and I had a pond, not a pond, a mud hole, where I'm pointing to right there. It was, cattle had been in there for years. I fenced them out when I got it, but the only other water source I had was by the road, and so what I learned, this is where I learned to siphon. So you can see the contour is a ridge, and basically I learned to siphon, and I set up 2 permanent siphons during the growing season, so I had water on both sides of that ridge. And until I did that, I was not able to do rotational grazing. In fact, Adam, not to blame NRCS, but I had NRCS that came out, and it was probably the person, but he walked the farm with me before I did this, and he said, this is better, just do continuous grazing here. I won't tell you who it was, but that's what I was recommending. So what if we have a pond that we can't siphon out of? This is in Greene County, Kentucky. This is actually at Lesbediza field that I showed you earlier that was taken out of row crops. This is not ideal. It's not NRCS approved, but is this better than giving them full access to that pond? By the way, do you all see how well behaved those cows are? It's almost like they think someone's going to hit them with a baseball bat if they get too close to that. By the way, has anyone been standing in water before and grabbed on to 10,000 volts? I have. I can assure you that is the best grounding you will ever have in your life. All right, here's Lucy Smith's farm. I was hoping she was going to be here today. The blue dots you see this is a 500-acre farm. This is in the very northeast, I think it's the northeast corner. Those are her closer water source, which are 2,000 feet away. So they use a pond there. Unfortunately, just like in most of Kentucky, they just let the cattle have full access. So we fenced it out. Jeff Lemcooler and I are helping her out with this. And I did not do this. What you're going to see here next is Jeff set this up. This is a very simple solar water pump. We'll talk about these. About $800, everything other than the tank, of course. But a simple system. It's not going to have a lot of pumping capacities, but it's good for getting water off the other side of the pond, 50 feet away, that sort of thing. And it costs very little. Whoops, back up. So if you had a small herd, if you had a 25 cow herd, that system costs about $800, $900. In 1 year with 25 cows, if you're on county water, you could pay for that system. Now you might have 2 ponds, so you could actually have 2 of those systems, one for each pond, right? And then if you had something go wrong with one, you can move them, they're kind of pain in the butt, but having 2 that you can do better. All right, this is the farm in New York. I didn't tell you about the water here. So there's a hydrant down here that we put in that comes from a spring just a little bit to the north. It's buried underground. We may do that for quite a few years. Jeff Miguel, who Brett knows well, what he then did is he put a really nice solar water pump system in. It's over half a mile long. In fact, there's a couple more spurs in there I'm not showing you. The elevation gain is at least 100 feet. We haven't figured out exactly, but it's at least 100 feet elevation gain. And it's like it's coming out of your pressurized county water up on top. Now, it's a much more expensive system. I'll show you that. So Jeff put this together. He estimated what it would cost to get a kit, basically. He put this together. No, he does not party in the pastures all the time. The keg is actually for a pressure regulator. So very, he's good with equipment. How are we doing, Tom?
We're 10 minutes.
Oh, sorry. So we're going to, okay. Sorry. So his cost was actually, now this was 4 or 5 years ago, so it would be more, but he said about $1,800 were his costs. Again, but he did a lot of the work. He said if you bought a package deal, maybe $3,000, which sounds like a lot, right? Until we compare it against what? What if we had a 50 cow herd? We could pay for that in what? 1 year. And then we'd have it for free, essentially, for the rest of our life, plus some maintenance. This is a farm in Hardin County. This is one that is doing the bale grazing for the project, Adam, and I just remembered I haven't given you the names, and I need to give you those. Oh, okay, perfect. So this is a rental farm. This is Patrick Preston. He actually is a full-time farmer. He does grain and cattle, and he's got like 5 farms that he rents. This is one of them. And we're doing the bale grazing here, and I asked him what's the water situation? What are we going to do there? And so when I got there, Patrick wanted to actually he was going to put county water in, just about like I'm showing you right there. And when we got out there, I saw the ponds, and the one in the northeast corner is actually in pretty good shape. The other one is abused, but I said, Patrick, it's simple to siphon out of that. So I'll show you we haven't done this yet. The one in the northeast corner is up fairly high, and we can essentially siphon and get to about that point. So he's going to when he brings the cattle in from the west side, he'll have to set up a laneway to get them over to the east. But then he basically is good to that point. He gets to about that point, and then we're going to set up a solar water pump in that other pond, and we're going to fence the cattle out of that. And so, anyways, we haven't done it yet, but we'll see how that goes next year. So I have not told you details about bale grazing. I promise you I'll give you a couple links. So there are 2 videos you can watch that I've put together. This is kind of the how-to of bale grazing. If you send me an email if you don't get this, and then the other one is more how can we use bale grazing as a tool. And I won't have time to do this here, but hopefully in the afternoon I will. But bale grazing is a great way to get through a drought. I just can't even imagine getting through a drought now without it. But we can talk about that this afternoon. There's the best information I've found on seed for the Chicory Plantain Center is a place in Great Britain and England, Cotswold Seeds. So look them up. They've got some really good, 5 minutes. Okay, we're good. So, I'm sorry? We have to go forward. So we'll get it afterwards. I've got a few more things. So we got 5 minutes. All I'm going to do is show you a series of pictures here. And then if we have to, I'll get you that information. So what I've given you is a bunch of small different ways that you can improve biological activity on your farm, right? So what I'm going to do now, and I did this 2 years ago, and it's a shorter version, but I'm going to show you just on an actual farm, that second farm in Woodford County. So basically doing all things we talked about, having a reasonable stocking rate, and I actually had to adjust that the first summer because it was so poor. What I thought was a reasonable stocking rate turned out to be too much for that farm because the production was so poor. Just good basic rotational grazing. I was not mob grazing, not that you can't, and we'll talk about that maybe this afternoon at the round table. Getting legumes in, the only thing I could get in this the first 2 years essentially was annual lesbadeza. That was the only legume I could get in there. I bale grazed 2 winters, and then had lots of weeds to clip the first 2 years. So I'm going to show you just a few pictures. This was the first winter I had. I actually started in the fall. It's February here, so I'm bale grazing slowly through the whole farm, even the crop field that first year, and then I stopped after that in the crop field. Let me back up. So look at that. No, I take the net rep off. I flip those, and by the way, those are 4x5 bales. They probably weigh 850 pounds. I'm a decent size, but you know Megan, right? Megan McCown. Megan McCown is probably, what, 5'4"? Megan can flip that bale right there with a hay hook. So we can talk more about that, but even if you can't, some people use their ATV with a hay hook and a small tow strap and pulled over. But no, I will flip that before I feed it and take the net wrap off. But look at so that had grown up from mid-June to that point. It was kind of a droughty fall, but would you all agree not much production there from June on? All right, so here's May 6th, the first spring I had it. Notice it's May 6th, I'm still feeding hay. That was the last bale I fed, so give 3 or 4 days, I'm done hay feeding, but I'm still feeding hay up to about May 9th or 10th. Production was that poor. The soil biology was dysfunctional, basically. You could see the chemical fertility like around the bales because that was the only thing driving that system. There was no biology. I was clipping all the pastures by the second rotation. That was the last one I clipped. It was mid-July or something. But you can see that was not an exaggeration. There were weeds like that throughout that farm that first year. Bale grazed 1 more winter, and then the next spring. Now, I will say this is the quickest I've ever turned a farm around, so it's typically you're not going to do it in 2 winters and 1 full grazing season. It's usually going to take 2 or 3. I had 15 years of experience with bale grazing, though, and a lot with these others. But all I'm going to tell you is, you remember May 6th, the previous winter, still feeding hay? This is essentially 1 year later after all that. No commercial fertilizer, just good grazing management, getting the biology going. And it wasn't like it was patchy. If it was patchy here and there, that would be chemical-based fertility. It was the whole farm was like that, other than the 6.5 acres up on top that was still dysfunctional. The soil biology was awakened. That's what it looked like this spring. So even that second year, I think the last bale I fed was mid-April, something like that. And so it's still improving. So 4 years later, whatever that is, the last bale I fed this last year was March 19th. And trust me, I'm not like trying to force the cattle not to eat hay. They just would not eat any more hay. The pasture was coming on. All right, so we're going to stop here. Hopefully have a few questions. And anything like links, we can either get it later on or send me an email. I'll make sure you get anything like that. But what questions do you all have? Yes? So let me paraphrase it. So I showed you a system where I'm not cutting my own hay. So all I will say is if you have a dysfunctional system like that, the best way you can bring it back is not to cut your own hay. Is to buy hay and import all that not just chemical nutrients, but that feed for your biology. Can you do it without cutting your own? You can, but it's going to take you a lot longer. So my advice is don't even try. That's what Lucy Smith tried to do. She tried to cut her own hay, and she's realizing she need to kickstart. She's got to import some nutrients and feed for the biology. So I would not recommend, if you're in a poor system like that, to cut your own hay, actually. Yes?
So I've seen your presentation on bale grazing, so I know what it is. But I've also just saw the results of the hay contest they did. And
Yeah.
so you have the bales out, you're losing nutrition by them being out there.
Or are you?
That's my question.
Yeah. So what's the answer? Let me tell you a very quick story. I'm from upstate New York, where Brett is. The first summer I was here, it was early August. I was on a farm visit in Russell County, and there was hay out along the fence row where we just went by, and I asked the farmer how many years that had been out there. Now, again, I'm from upstate New York. He looked at me like a look like that, like, what are you talking about? And he wasn't sure. He finally said, I just cut that a month and a half ago. I'm from upstate New York, where the temperature is what? A lot cooler. There's almost no humidity, even though Brett complains about it, compared to Kentucky. So what do you need for hay to rot? Actually, 3 things, but 2 things people most of the time think about. You need moisture and you need warm temperatures for the biology to be active. Which of those do you not have in the wintertime? The warm temperatures. I'm not going to say you have no rot, but it will be so close to no rot. In fact, you can see it. So the bottom side, that's where it was sitting. You all see that bale? That slightly brown spot is where that had been sitting for about a month and a half to 2 months. Does it look like there's much rot? You're only going to get decreasing nutrition if that biology breaks that hay down. That's why if it was square bales and that rain is coming through, if I set that bale out just like you see it for 2 months, the hay won't break down, but what will happen, the rain will soak into it and it will start molding. And I've seen that. I have one of my bale grazers was so stubborn, he said, I'm going to do it. And I said, they're not going to eat it. And after the first few were fine, but the hay he got to about a month and a half after he set out like that, the cattle would not hardly touch it. Hay bales are made like that for a reason. They shed water very good. Most of the rot, by the way, comes from where? It doesn't come from the top. It comes from where? Underneath. Brett? You want to come to Kentucky, set up a farm? Be happy that you have it. Let me back up with those links. Oh, you did? I'll just put it on there.
Yes.
If everyone could please fill out your forms, that way we'll be better prepared for you next year of what you might need. We can take them up front.